Good evening, participants. Welcome back to lecture 3 of this 10 days lecture series on history of American literature. Today we have among with us Dr. Manju Kumari K. She, as she introduces herself, is a self-directed, enthusiastic facilitator with a passionate commitment to student development and the learning experience. Her areas of specialization are Native American literature and Indian writing in English. Yet her interest and passion for teaching has made her delve into the various genres of literature like the British literature, African American literature, post-colonial literature, world classics in literature, and many more. Dr. Manju's 15 years of teaching career has showered her award in 2018, which is the Shri P.K. Das Memorial Best Faculty Award, organized by the Nehru Group of Institutions, Coimbatore, followed by the Excellence Teaching in Higher Education Award, organized by the DK International Research Foundation, Perambalur, which is in Tamil Nadu, in connection with International Conference on Recent Trends in Art, Science, Engineering, and Technology. Besides, she has recently received the International Educator Award of 2021 from the International Institute of Organized Research, which is a registered MSME, and under the Government of India, which, under the Government of India, she has been, these awards are a sort of motivation which she feels has always played a driving force to be a very dedicated and enthusiastic in her career. Dr. Manju's interest branched out into research, and at present she has been guiding and producing postgraduate students, MPhil scholars, and currently guiding 3 PhD scholars. Further branching into academics, she has served as a resource person and shared sessions for various national conferences, symposiums, seminars, and webinars. She also is a member of various editorial boards for reputed national and international journals, and is also in the member board of studies for various institutions. Dr. Manju, it's an absolute pleasure and honor to have you today. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation and coming on this platform. We are truly honored and we are grateful to you for accepting our invitation. I'm sure the topic today, which Dr. Manju will be dealing, that is the American Revolution, politics, and patriotism. We are looking forward for this exciting session. The platform is all yours, Dr. Manju. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for that warm welcome. And I'm here happy to be on this online lecture series, which is on the history of American literature. And my appreciation to all the participants today, the learned fraternity, and the students who are eagerly waiting to listen. We have been 2 days through this online lecture series, and we have been listening to the exploration and the colonial period. And from there, we are just moving on to today, which is the third topic, the American Revolution, focusing mainly on the politics and the patriotism during the period 1765 to 1790. I have put up few pictures then and there on the slides to just get a better idea or a kind of an exposure which we have never seen during that period. And a small highlights on the previous 2 lectures, a quick recap, the exploration period, the characteristics which you'll already know. Literature is composed of European writings that describe the explorers' travels and impressions of the continent and its native people. So the native people were like this before the Britishers could explore or come into the American country. The literature of this period comes in a form of letters and journals written by the explorers who's put their foot in the American nation, as well as the Native American literary tribal leaders. They were called tribal leaders. And a few glance towards the colonial period. which was during the 1607 to 1765. Characteristics of this particular period is the previous lecture which you'll listen to. This colonial period was dominated by the Puritan beliefs, and literature of this period is usually focusing on the historical, religious, and the didactic. And during this period, we could find the slavery, and the first slave narratives were written at this time. As this picture goes, you can see how the Britishers and how the natives are. There is a woman and a child being auctioned for sale as slaves to these Europeans. This imaginative, the part of literature which we all enjoy and look into its beauty, the aesthetic sense of it, was banned during this time, and it was considered to be immoral. So this colonial period, the literature was in the form of tracts, journals, polemics, narratives, sermons, and very few poetry. So getting into these two periods, the next most important event which happened during the American history is the Revolutionary period, which was during the 1765 to 1790. A bit of its characteristics I would like to tell before we could get in deep into it. This revolutionary period usually is referred to the writings that are politically motivated, either in the support of the British rule or in the support of the American patriotism and independence. Or sometimes it has been related to the Constitution. So the American country as such, you take the nation, was divided into two because the people were supporting British rule, and there were few Americans who wanted their own independence. There was a beginning of the Constitution, and few literary works were written on the Constitution as well. So this writing of this time is dominated by a lot of political documents. The speeches by the people, the Americans, they were Americans who were opposing the British rule. So there were documents and speeches on that. There were few Americans who supported the British rule, and there were speeches and letters based on it, which we'll be looking in detail. So this period, 1750 to 1800, is also known as a period of enlightenment, because there is a lack of emphasis and dependence on the Bible, and more use of the logical and science was there, which was otherwise simply known as common sense. So being dominated, being colonized, these Native Americans were not able to go against them. But this period, this revolutionary period, the very term revolution speaks about something which you are revolting. So this period, this revolution happened only because of the enlightenment which came into the minds of the Americans, and they started to think logically, and the interference of science brought in people to not deviate from being religious, because the previous period which we saw was Puritanism, and they were so much abided by religious faith. They assumed it to be a sin to deviate from the ideologies. So this particular period, a revolution, this change, this transformation from the colonial period brought in a lot of enlightenment in the people. They started to think for themselves, they started to voice for themselves, and they felt the interference of science and the logical thinking made them to believe that there was not completely uh, to believe the truths, and they were just the truths of religion, but they were just expanding from that. So there was not a divorce from the Bible here, theology or religious beliefs, but it was just adding to, or it was expanding of the truth which was already existing among the minds of these people. Because these Native Americans, or these Americans, they had their own way of praying, their own way of religious faith and belief. But when they were colonized, and when these Britishers, Europeans, colonized them, there was a mixture of faith, there was a mixture of belief, there was a mixture of truths which they were, certain people adhere to their own beliefs, certain people they follow the European way of belief. So there was again a clash there, and these did not happen overnight. It has been into their system for quite a very long time. So what is this period, and how this period, this revolutionary period, different from the previous colonial period? So they are still under the control, or still being colonized by the Europeans, but they started to drift, they started to transform, they started to change. So what could be those things? So during the 18th century, writings shifted from the Puritanism of Winthrop and Bradford to the Enlightenment ideas of reasoning. Why should we do this? What are these? Who are these? These WH questions brought in a kind of a enlightenment in the minds of these Americans. So the belief that human and natural occurrences were messages from God was the belief of the colonial period, and which no longer fit into the budding anthropocentric culture which people started to reason. So many intellectuals believe that the human mind could comprehend the universe through the laws of physics, which is science, and which was already described by Isaac Newton. So one of these is a colonial writer, Cotton Mather. I put up the picture for you. So this particular person has focused not only on the beliefs of religion or theology, but also brought in the natural and the ideas of Newton. So this was the first book published in North America that promoted the idea of science along with natural theology. That was Cotton Mather's The Christian Philosopher, which was published in 1721. So what were the changes which happened during this era? There was an enormous scientific, economic, social, political changes which happened in the 18th century, which was called Enlightenment, and which it had a good impact on the authority of clergymen and the scripture, making way for the democratic principles. So being from the scripture and from the theological part to the democratic principles, that itself is a drastic change in the era which the American society saw. So this increased, what happened? Increased the population, which helped to account for a greater diversity of opinion. So there was a difference of opinion coming into the minds of the Americans, in particular to religious as well as political life, which was going very simultaneously in the society, and that invariably reflected on literature of that particular time. So as we saw on the earlier slides, there is letters, there is journals, and there is speeches or document writing, which was prevailing that time, which was a mixture of religious as well as the political life of the 18th century. So the growth in the communities, as I said, there was a diversity of knowledge, there was diversity of opinions or thinking. So this made in a lot of communities to prop up in America. So in 1670, the population of colonies was nearly a number of 1 lakh or so. And 30 years later, it was 2 lakhs and 50,000. And by 1760, it reached a crore or so. So the growth in communities was therefore increasing, which brought in a lot of social change. And this social life led people to become more interested in the progress of individuals. So it is not the society as such, the individuals, and they share the experience of colonies. So you must be wondering, what is this colonies? There were 13 colonies in the North America, which was under the control of the British Empire, or the Great Britain, as they call them. So these colonies, they started to voice out their own experience, which they have undergone as individuals or as a community as such. And these new ideas can be seen in a popular work of Benjamin Franklin, his autobiography, which we'll see later. So these are the 13 colonies in America. So when Americans revolted against Great Britain in 1776, the colonists' actions were fueled by influential political writings in favor of independence. I would like to make one thing here, like how today's modern or the technological facilities we have today, those days, years, centuries back, that did not prevail. It was all through writings. It was all through letters and documents. So the only thing which could bring in a lot of difference is the work, the literature, or the writings of these people who triggered the patriotic or changed the political scenario at that time through their writings. So it is to be appreciated, or which is shock to today's generation, because everything is in the click of a finger today. So those days it was all the political writings, it was the letters, it was the documents that was influential to bring in independence to 13 colonies and many more countries around the world from the hands of the British. So the British had 13 flourishing colonies on the Atlantic coast. They were Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, Pennsylvania, Delaware, New Jersey, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. So all these 13 colonies were under the control or under the rule of the British Empire. The writers who helped inspire the American Revolution based all their arguments on the ideals of this rationalism. The founding fathers of America. The founding fathers of America, it must be a new for many of you. So these are the people who took initiatives to voice for their independence, to free their country from the rule of the British, to save their own people. So here we have these 8 people: George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Samuel Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and John Gay. So all these people wrote letters, pamphlets, speeches, which all triggered the Americans to start thinking logically and revolt against the British Empire. So what was the contribution of these founding fathers? So without these founding fathers, the United States of America wouldn't have been what it is today. These founding fathers, a group of predominantly wealthy plantation owners, they are businessmen, united all these 13 desperate colonies, and they fought for their independence from the Great Britain and penned a series of influential governing documents that steer the country even today. So this was a contribution, the major contribution by the founding fathers, the 8 founding fathers, as I told you. So all these founding fathers, including the first 4 US presidents, that is George Washington during the period of 1789 to 1797, John Adams, the second president, 1797 to 1801, Thomas Jefferson, 1801 to 1809, the James Madison, 1809 to 1817. All these US presidents, these 4 US presidents, considered themselves to be the subjects of the British Empire. But what did they do? They revolted against this restrictive rule of King George III. And I put up King George III's picture for you all to have a glance. And they outlining their grievance in the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence is a document. It is a written document which really steered the minds of the Americans at large to voice for their independence, and after the war, how they have declared the independence. So it is a powerful call for freedom and above all equality. Equality should be there amongst the Americans. There shouldn't be any sort of a discrimination. And this particular declaration of independence won a stunning military victory over what was then the world's preeminent superpower. So this declaration of independence was a powerful call for the freedom of the Americans. And not only that, on the whole, though it is applied to the leaders who initiated the Revolutionary War and the frame and it helped to frame the Constitution, this Declaration of Independence paved way for many other countries to voice for their independence. So this kind of a trauma which is being set there, the voicing of people brought in a lot of psychological issues among the people who lived in the colonies. So this tension between the colonies and the Great Britain event caused a lot of psychological issues among the common people. And among those events which took place, the civil wars, the wars, these two wars were the predominant one. One is the Boston Massacre, which took place in 1770. It was a patriotic mob attack, a British loyalist who fired a gun at them by killing a boy. This really triggered the people's mind, and this massacre killed a massive crowd of Americans, and many people were left without their beloved ones. They were fatherless children. So this brought in a lot of psychological issues in the American society. The next followed after 2 years was the Boston Tea Party, where an American political and mercantile protest on the British Parliament's tax for tea. There was a huge tax which the people have to pay for the tea, which was exported from China to America. And these people, these Americans, they wanted to revolt against this taxation on tea, and they didn't want to have the tea product. So they threw all those the commodities into the Boston harbor. So this also caused a lot of riot, and people were hurt, were injured, and killed during this Boston Tea Party also. So leading not only to the psychological issues, but also to many other issues. And this is a picture of the Boston Massacre, the bloody massacre, which was in the King Street in Boston, where you can find the Britishers firing at the common people who are protesting, voicing for the death of the boy. It also led to a lot of social issues. So during and after the war, social issues had an impact on the people and literature as well. In every writings, as I told you, be it the letters, the speeches, the manuscripts, all of them had this impact of social and psychological issues. The colonies faced social issues and began to develop an urge to separate them from the British Empire. So this triggered the revolutionary spirit that grew among the people in all the 13 colonies in North America. So there were not only psychological issues, sociological issues, but they also were issues like gender inequality, class discrimination, and many more, which were seen in literature. The cultural issues which brought a change in the culture in America, as I told you, every country, every colony for that matter, wanted to become independent and began to separate itself from the mother country, England. So each call, as I told you, Massachusetts, New York, Virginia, North Carolina was different from South Carolina. So all these colonies tried to be independent, which brought in again a cultural issue there. So they developed their own way, and this led to an increased number of colonial literature during the period. Through pamphlets, newspapers, novels that portrayed what is going on in the war. So the psychological, sociological, cultural issues. Apart from this, there was a lot of economical issues, political issues, which we'll see. touching upon the political writing. So the American Revolutionary period, which is the 1775 to 1783, was notable for the political writings of these prominent people: Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Paine, and Thomas Jefferson. During this period was the first early novel written in America. It was by William Hill Brown's The Power of Sympathy, or which is otherwise known as The Triumph of Nature, published in 1791, a sentimental novel which is written in an epistolary form, which is in a form of letters. The entire novel is comprised like that. So let us have a glance on one of the prominent person during this revolutionary period, Benjamin Franklin, 1706 to 1790. He's one of the founding fathers, as we have already seen. He is a polymath. Polymath here means a multi-talented person, where you can see the list which I have put up here. He was a leading writer, a printer, a political philosopher, a politician, a Freemason, postmaster, scientist, inventor, humorist, civic activist, statesman, and a diplomat. So Benjamin Franklin has a lot which he has contributed to the American society through different fields of which he explored. So as a writer, we could find here few of his works: the autobiography, The Art of Making, Wealth and Wisdom, Poor Richard's Almanac, The Art of Procuring Pleasant Dreams, and many more. As a scientist, Benjamin Franklin was a major figure in the American Enlightenment era, and his history of physics for his discoveries and theories regarding electricity was welcomed. And as an inventor, he is known for the lighting rod, the bifocals, and the Franklin stove, among all other inventions. So Benjamin Franklin founded many civic organizations, including the Library Company, Philadelphia's first fire department, and the University of Pennsylvania. So this is the attributes or the contributions by Benjamin Franklin during during this period. And these works, the Poor Richard Almanac, the biography of Benjamin Franklin, are esteemed works with their wit and influence towards the formation of a budding American identity. So that time only it is propping up. Why budding? Like the flower, it is budding up. Budding, the identity for America was seen then only. The next person who is equally important during the American Revolution is Thomas Paine. His famous pamphlet, Common Sense, and the American Crisis. These writings are seen as playing a key role in influencing the political tone of the time. So these pamphlets triggered the minds of the Americans to look into what is happening in their political scenario or the political influence by the British on them. And they started to voice out for their own nation. So the next, one second. Franklin, we can find these are the other political writings by the colonists. We have Samuel Adams, we have Quincy, we have John Dickinson, and Joseph Galloway. So these are the writers. I have put up the pictures for you all to have a glance of how they were during that revolutionary period, and their contributions by these colonists also had an impact on the American literature. Samuel Adams, we can see him during the period in 1722 to 1803, an American statesman, political philosopher, and he was one of the founding fathers of the United States, who protested the British taxation without representation. So everything was taxed because to compensate the Britishers, to compensate a lot of other things, they were taxing the people heavily and without any kind of a representation before. There was no kind of an information, there was no kind of a notice being given, but the tax were levied on them. So Samuel Adams was one of the person who protested the British taxation, uniting the American colonies, the 13 colonies, in the fight for independence during the Revolutionary War. So it is not an easy task to bring in all the 13 colonies, all the Americans amidst the British the rule. To bring them all together to fight was not an easy task. So being here a politician in the colonial Massachusetts, a leader of movement that became an American Revolution. So Samuel Adams later became a very controversial figure in the American history, and his accounts of writing in the 19th century was a real praise to his contribution in the American literature. The other person is Joseph Galloway. During the 1731 to 1803, he's an American politician. He became a loyalist during the American Revolutionary War. After serving as a delegate to the First Continental Congress from Pennsylvania. So in 1774, he believed to have a plan of a proposed union between Great Britain and the colonies. So when there is a plan proposed, what he means by that is a kind of an agreement without any prior notice. They levy tax, they wage for war, they come in a lot of rules and regulations. So let there be a plan between the 13 colonies and the Great Britain was Joseph Galloway's idea. So the next one, the most important, as we saw the different events which took place in the American Revolution, the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, the Civil Wars. One among all that is the Stamp Act of 1765. So this Stamp Act was the first internal tax introduced by George Granville in 1712 to 1770, which levied directly on the American colonists by the British Parliament. So it imposed tax on all the paper documents in the colonies that should be produced on stamped papers produced in London carrying the embossed revenue stamp. I think we are all familiar with today's, we get all our will and documents with the stamp paper. So this was introduced in during this revolutionary period by the Britishers, and they were taxing the colonies. So this caused a lot of this Stamp Act focused more on the political issues. So the printed materials include the legal documents, the magazines, playing cards, newspaper, many other types of paper using throughout the colonies and paid in the British currency and not in the colonies' paper money. So they were not considered worthy. These 13 colonies, the money which they had, their money was not considered at all, but the British currency. So they had to get those currencies. They need to pay for their paper documents, anything, be it newspaper or magazine, and that was a kind of a revenue for the Britishers. So you can see it is a special tax put on all paper goods to pay for the F and the First World War, that is the French and the Indian War. That is how the war has been called. It is these colonists refused to pay the tax and would not buy the items that were being taxed. So they started to boycott. So the Stamp Act had a great impact in this revolutionary period. You can see the very symbol which I have given. They have put a cross of the crown, and the Stamp Act with a kind of a skeleton. These were the kind of an oppositions, or the means of which they want to boycott these Stamp Act. The purpose of the tax was to pay for the British military troops stationed in the American colonies after the French and the Indian War. So to pay the military troops, they were taxing the American colonies, the 13 colonies. So this Stamp Act was very unpopular among the colonists because they started to revolt, they started to boycott. So it did not have its stand, but it brought a good transformation in the American society. The colonial assemblies set petitions and protests. The Stamp Act Congress held in New York City was the first significant joint colonial response to the British measure when it petitioned Parliament and the King. So, this was the first time all the 13 colonies, the most significant people, joined together to go against the British Empire. And what was their slogan? No taxation without representation. So this was their slogan, which had a very good impact among the colonists. When the British Empire was in deep debt for the Seven Years' War, which prevailed in 1756 to 1769, it was a global conflict, a struggle for global primacy between the Britain and France, which also had a major impact in Spanish Empire. So it looked into the Northern American colonies, these 13 colonies, for its revenue, for its money sources. So the British Empire was completely depended on the North American 13 colonies for revenue. So what came to be known as the 7 Years of War? This began as a conflict between the Great Britain and France in 1754, when the British sought to expand its territory claimed by the French in North America. So this war came to be known as the French and Indian War. So in the year 1765, the Parliament imposed the Stamp Act on March 22nd and repealed it in 1766 but issued a declaratory act at the same time to reaffirm its authority to pass any colonial legislation act. So we find this particular revolutionary period in America mostly focuses on, as I told you, the documentary writing, the political writings, as well as based on the constitutions. So this declaratory act was passed by all the 13 colonies. So the issue of taxation and representation raised by the Stamp Act religion, sorry, strained relations with the colonies to the point that 10 years later, the colonies rised in armed rebellion against the British. So you can see how the Americans are, gaining their strength after 10 years to revolt against the British colonies. So the reason for raising revenue is due to the 7 Years' War, which ended with a long rivalry between the French and the British, that is France and Britain. As a result, Britain gained control over North America, and France, without putting foot in the continent, leading to the victory of the war. So, however, the British Empire, though fell in deep debt, leading the colonies to shoulder the cost, there were few people who were against the Stamp Act. So, one among them is Patrick Henry, who was the Stamp Act opponent. Uh, he served as the first and the sixth post colonial Virginia governor. He is known for his "Gimme Liberty or Give Me Death." It's a very strong quote by Patrick Henry, and he delivered a speech before a meeting of Virginia's colonial leaders in 1775. It was an effort to mobilize a militia against the possible attack by the British. So I put one of his important quote here, which says, "I know not what others may choose, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death." So this was one of his very strong words during the meeting, which moved a lot of Americans or made the Americans to think about their liberty. So what is the root of the colonial resistance? So the root of the colonial resistance amongst the economical hardship was they rejected the British government's arguments. So they were not able to accept when they oppose, automatically there is a fall. an economic, a political, a social fall when they are striving to go against the British governments. And they insisted that only their representative assemblies could levy tax directly, and internal tax imposed by the Stamp Act was done away with. So you can see, has the pictures here I have depicted, you can see how Patrick Henry is voicing for the Americans. You can find here how the British government is discussing on the various aspects on how to bring these colonies under them, and to impose tax on them. So how these, so far what we saw, these the Stamp Act, be the war, be the other changes in the American society, what kind of an impact it had on the types of literature during that particular period of time. So it was political writing. There were a few autobiographies, very little poems, a lot of speeches, pamphlets, almanac, and declarations. And these kind of writings were represented through few authors, prominent authors. Like we see Thomas Jefferson, we find a lot of document writing, political writing produced or contributed to him, by him. We find Benjamin Franklin's autobiography, which is all his experiences of being through this British rule and an independence is being depicted there. The speeches of Patrick Henry was made as a influential lit part of a literature which moved the huge mob of the 13 colonies. Pamphlets by Thomas Paine is most influential work. The Common Sense brought in a lot of changes in the American society. And we have Abigail Adams through the letters, which again arose the patriotical and the political changes in the American society. So this revolutionary period, there is a particular literary style which they followed, though it had its still slight influence of the British, yet they emphasized on reason as opposed to faith. There was a rise of empirical science, philosophy, and theology. That's why this period is called the Enlightenment era. And it was a shift to more print-based culture, because newspaper, magazine, pamphlets, so a lot of printing was brought into existence. And this literary scene has a sign of status here, an improvisation in the American society. So it also had instructive in values, so they did not lose their own culture or values, so that also was imparted in their literary style. They were highly political and patriotic in writing, which really triggered the minds of the Americans to go against the British Empire. So these writers also focused on explaining and justifying the American Revolution. So why are they want to revolt against this British Empire? They justified that through their writings. And during this revolutionary period and a little after that, the literary style moved on to something which was called as the early nationalism. Until then, they were under the British colony, the revolutionary period. But once when they gained their independence and these colonies were free, they were termed as the early nationalism. So this nationalism made them to bring in a rooted identity towards their own country. So the writers began to ponder what it really means to be an American, because so many years they were under the British rule. So now they started to think, being an American, what is their identity? That was produced in their writings. So after the war in 1812, which removed the British troops from the North America, there was an even more greater force of nationalism, patriotism, and American identity among all the Americans. As I told you all earlier, there was one sect of people who were supporting the British rule, who were gaining influence and who were happy with them. There were the other majority people who were revolting against the British rule. So these two kind of an sect of people were Americans. So some were influenced by the British, some were purely only wanted their American identity. So such kind of a even difference in writings was being seen during this early nationalism period in the American society. So the patriotic and political writings, focusing on them, words may have been just as important as weapons in the American cause, in the American revolutionary cause. So, as the quote goes, pen is mightier than a sword. These people, these colonies, these countries which were under the rule of the British all over the world, they all took up words, they took up writing for their main cause for independence. So, through their writings, words were so powerful that triggered the minds of the people to voice for themselves, find an identity, and to revolt against the huge British Empire, which is always termed as the Great Britain. So these patriotic writings came in many varieties by many people, and some were crude efforts designed to sway public opinion to a cause, a particular cause, some writings, and the others were well reasoned political arguments, and some others were just collection of inspirational verses, like how we have our Rabindranath Tagore, our Sarojini Naidu, and so many other writers who inspired, triggered the minds of the people, their own countrymen, to fight for their independence. American writers were firmly established as important contributors to a uniquely American national identity. So their ultimate focus was their own identity. Where do they stand? They don't want to be so called as a part of the British. So what is their identity? This question, an identity separate from the colonists' European roots. We don't want that. We want to be entirely Americans. What is our identity? What is our style? What is our contribution? What is our society? That was predominantly running in the minds of many writers. And many of these writers who rose to prominence during this revolutionary period became even more famous after this period was over. So people looked upon their contributions. And this age, this particular revolutionary period is also known as the age of reason or enlightenment, like how we do have it in the British literature, we have it in the American literature also. So here the writers valued reason over faith, so which brought in a drastic change in the society, made people think and revolt against the British Empire. So this was a major change from the Puritan period and the belief in God for salvation to the age of enlightenment, or otherwise called reason. So the belief in the power of science, as I told you, the printing press began. People began to invent. The Americans also were able to equally do things as the British. They were no less in it. And this led to further human development in the society. So Americans started to picturize, they started to look into their own strengths. So, what does it mean to revolt? To attempt or to overthrow an authority. So, the authority here is the British Empire, and they are taking an attempt to throw them off the state, to rebel and to oppose. When they say tax, they say no to tax. And when they say you got to do this, they rebel and say no. Why? They start questioning. The reasoning comes. So these 13 American colonies started to rebel against the Great Britain. So this particular period, the revolutionary period, had a great impact, and it had a lot of influential factors. Like the moment was marked by the emphasis on rationality, scientific inquiries, and representative government. Representative government for the people and how the people are moving for it. The common thought that America and her people were destined for greatness because of the triumph of American independence. So when I use the word common thought, it is the entire American nation as such. It is not of separate colonies. It is not the voice of the mother country, England. So, with the exception of outstanding political writing, however, few works, if not, appear during and soon after the American independence. moving on to the genres of literature during this particular period, one important prose work. As I told you, there was less of poetry, more of letters, more of essays, more of pamphlets, which was prominent during this particular period. One among them is the prose or the essay by Thomas Jefferson. His period is during 1743 to 1826. He's an American statesman, a diplomat, lawyer, an architect, a philosopher, and one of the founding fathers of the United States. He also served as the third president of USA in 1801 to 1809. He is very famous for the Declaration of Independence, which was published in 1776. The fact that he owned over 600 enslaved people during his life while forcefully advocating for human freedom and equality made Jefferson one of the Americans' most problematic and paradoxical heroes. So he had the Declaration of Independence been given to him to be drafted, and he had to even voice out or advocate for the Americans' freedom and equality. So this essay, Declaration of Independence, was adopted by the Second Constitutional Congress, states the reason the British colonies of North America who sought independence in July 1776. So this is the declaration which had so many points, okay? And the very declaration opens with a preamble describing documents necessary in explaining why these 13 colonies have overthrown their rules and chosen to take their place as a separate nation in the world. So this was the um, entire one used in this Declaration of Independence. So what was the impact of this declaration? The impact of independence proved to be a pivotal piece of work as why the colonies were declaring independence. So as I told you, the 13 colonies, Massachusetts, New York, Virginia, Carolina, and so many other places, Maryland, all these colonies started to voice for their independence. So they started declaring, we need independence. So Jefferson emphasized that the body of people has the right to change the government if that government becomes oppressive, and the existing government was Great Britain. So these people started to voice, they wanted a change of the government. So this principle that led the foundation for seeking independence, then this was stated in Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. It also served as a document for the other nations to seek independence. As I told you earlier, the other nations took this Declaration of Independence as an example or as a motivation for them also to seek independence. So this is the Declaration of Independence, which was proposed, which was declared in 1776. This is how the colonies worked. One more important person is Richard Henry Lee, 1732 to 1794, an American statesman and founding father from Virginia, who proposed a resolution for independence in 1776. So Lee was the driving force behind the creation of the intercolonial committees of correspondence. So all these 13 colonies, there were one person, and that one person was brought into as a committee, and he saw that all these 13 intercolonial committees were together for the independence, for the even to declare the resolution for independence. So it was not an easy task by Richard Henry Lee, but he made it happen. And this Congress, this colonial Congress, was appointed a committee to draft the Declaration of Independence. So under this Declaration of Independence, had all the rules of stating why we need to free ourselves as a separate nation from the British Empire. So the gathering was by John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, Robert Livingston, and Roger Sherman. So these people started to draft the Declaration of Independence. And among them, Thomas Jefferson was the youngest, and he was given the job of drafting the declaration. So, being the youngest among all, he had the job to draft it. And when he drafted, later on, it became an essay for American literature and one of the important contributions in American literature. So he drew on ideas from the Enlightenment and also turned the political philosophies of the 18th century European real political practice. So Jefferson expressed three main ideas. People have concern inalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Above all, he focused on all men are created equal and all men have the rights. So this was one of his predominant idea. The next person whom we would see is Thomas Paine, 1737 to 1809. He is an English born American political pamphleteer. So he is born as a Britisher, and he became an American political person who fought against the Britishers itself. He was an activist, a philosopher, and a revolutionist. His ideas reflected on the Enlightenment era, ideals, and the transnational human rights. And his prominent work is Common Sense, the essay Common Sense in 1776, which was a 47-page pamphlet advocating the independence from the Great Britain to the people in the 13 colonies. It was a very clear and a persuasive prose. So Paine marshaled moral as well as political arguments to encourage common people in the 13 colonies to fight for egalitarian government. This egalitarian government means a social equality for all the people. That is known as the egalitarian government. So, what is the impact of this common sense, this essay? Common Sense is the first work that openly asked for independence from the British. It was a hugely influential pamphlet that made the 13 colonies to use their common sense to break away from the British rule and to become as an independent nation. So this was it had a great impact on the minds of America. So Thomas Paine's essay, the Common Sense, was a central text behind the call for American independence from the Britain. Thomas Paine's brilliant arguments were very straightforward, and it focused on two important aspects. One is the independence from England. The second one was the creation of a democratic republic. These are the two main arguments which he proposed. And I put up one of his quote from the essay, Common Sense. He says, "Society in every state is a blessing, but government, even in its best state, is but a necessary evil. In its worst state, an intolerable one." So they are in the last line, which he said, under the British rule, an intolerable one, and they wanted to be free. So Paine advocated to promote reason and free thought that argued against the institutionalized religion in general and Christianity. He wanted independence and immediate action because he completely opposed the monarchy system of governance. In the essay Common Sense, Paine connected independence with common dissenting Protestant belief as a means to present a distinctly American political identity, which served really as a sermon to all the American citizens. It is also considered to be one of the political pamphlet. Most popular form of political literature of the day was Thomas Paine's Common Sense. It was over 2,000 pamphlets. Imagine that's the time the printing press was introduced, used by the Americans, and 2,000 pamphlets were published during this revolutionary period. And Thomas Paine sold over a lakh of copies in the first 3 months of its publication. So you can just imagine what kind of an impact it would have had in the minds of the American, especially in the 13 colonies. The next important people during the revolutionary period is Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, who were popularly known for their essay or the treatise as such, the Federalist Papers, 1788. So this treatise on free government in peace and security. This was their motto. It is an outstanding American contribution to literature on constitutional democracy and federalism. Federalism is to have a government of one's own, to change the government according to the common people's mind. So, widely considered to be the classic of the Western political thought. So, not only common sense, but also the Federalist Papers had an impact. It was written and published to urge the New Yorkers to ratify the proposed United States Constitution drafted in Philadelphia in 1787. So you can see how the people are looking into the papers, the Constitution, the proposed United States Constitution. It is a collection of 85 articles in a form of essays written by not only Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, but John Jay also contributed essays under the collective pseudonym Plumis, which is named after a general who helped to found the Roman Republic. So these Federalist Papers is the most authoritative text concerning the interpretation of American Constitution and an insight into the farmer's intent. It is divided into two parts. The first part completely discusses the defects of the present government, that is the Articles of the Federation. The second part of it discusses the new constitution's components, that is legislative, executive, and judicial branches. So these two were very, very new to the people, and it was welcomed by all the Americans as well. So Alexander and James argued that the decentralization of power that existed under the Articles of Confederation prevented the new nation from becoming strong enough to compete on the world. So, what was the impact of this Federalist Papers? It is a slim majority of New York delegates who voted in favor of the Constitution on condition that the amendments would be added, securing certain additional rights. So, everything, as I told you in the beginning, it is a documents, it is letters, it is pamphlets, it is about the constitution, it is about the declaration of independence. So very few people took it up serious or supported their own people as Americans. So they wanted, that is what it is saying, a slim majority of New York delegates voted in favor of the constitution. So it is a new constitution and there was a very little people who supported it. So Alexander and James also argued that the existing government, the first constitution, was defective. It needed a kind of remedy in weakness without endangering the liberties of the people. So these Federalist Papers started to bring in a kind of a analysis, a very comprehensive analysis of what? Of ideals of justice. Is the justice given to the people of America? A general welfare, is this, if you're going to impose something, an act, or if you're going to set up a rule, in general, is it for the welfare of the people? And in no way it should affect the rights of the individual. So these Federalist Papers were focusing on these three aspects mainly. And the Federalist Papers, the authors argued the possibility of a good government. So they wanted to lay in the crafting of political institutions that would compensate for deficiency in both reason and virtue in the ordinary conduct of politics. So when you are designing rules for people in order to bring in a good government, which is absolutely new to the Americans, they should think of crafting those political laws to compensate the things which is lacking. So they should use their reason as well as the virtue for the welfare of the common people. So this theme was predominant in the 18th century, and this was a political thought of entire America. So the authors of this Federalist Papers argued for an increase in the energy. They use the word energy, which is very familiar today. We use the word power of the federal government to oppose to this crisis. So, however, the national government's increased power would have to be based in and retain a federal distribution of power. They are republican principles, that would be no return to monarchical rule or consolidation of a central authority. British Empire was a central authority, and they have their control. It was monarchical rule, but they insisted, this Federalist Papers insisted that it should not be so. The next important genre of literature during the period was drama, and the prominent person is Royal Tyler, 1757 to 1826. He's Royal Tyler. He's an American jurist, playwright, who served in Massachusetts militia during the American Revolution. And in 1780, Tyler became a lawyer, a justice in the Supreme Court. His play, The Contrast, which was published in 1787, is a comic satire of the 17th century. And this is the first American comedy written by an American citizen that was professionally produced. So until then, there was no American citizen writing a drama, and he gets the credit of producing the first American comedy in 1787. So this play was inspired by Sheridan's The School for Scandal, which is a British comedy. So this is the a short gist, or just to highlight on how this play, The Contrast, is associated to the revolutionary period. This play, The Contrast, reveals a contrast between the Americans and the Europeans. What could be the contrast between the Americans and the Europeans? It was the way they dress, their mannerisms, their culture, their habits. So how these Americans and these Europeans differ. The contrast was revealed in this um, play, The Contrast. It also mocks on the Americans who follow the British upper class. Though they are Americans, they slowly tend to lose their own identity by following the British upper class ways and habits. So it is not only does it depict the morals regarding the American man, but also expresses the substance of women, how women were during this revolutionary period. So this particular play, Contrast, touches not only upon one aspect, but it touches on these major women, men, the contrast between American and Europeans, and the people who blindly follow the British upper class. So Royal Tyler uses the form to satirize Americans who follow British fashion and indulge in British vices. So the very title, The Contrast, refers to serving the contrast, the difference between the British and the American culture and lifestyle. One can find the stress placed upon the importance of the Commonwealth as opposed to as an individual. So he's not focusing on one particular character or an individual and showing how that character is stressed or the tensions underwent during this revolutionary period, but no, he gives a place for importance for the Commonwealth rather than an individual. So to have an overview of this play, The Contrast itself is a comedy of manners which evaluates human homemade versus foreign goods. This was a predominant, as we saw, the Boston Tea Party, like that. The difference between homemade, that is American products, and the foreign goods. Its leading character is Jonathan, who is manly servant who represent the New England Yankee. So this Yankee is which we'll see in the later part of the presentation. These are the people who are unsophisticated, or they assume the British sophistication, okay, and they assume themselves to be a part of the upper class British. So he is Jonathan, who is an unsophisticated countryman, a patriot and a honest person, who is a servant of Colonel Henry Manley, who is a persona of America, a gentleman, a patriot, and a hero. So this very two characters itself, you can bring in the difference between the American and the European culture. We have Billy Dimple, who is a snobbish wreck, who indulges in the European fashion. Being an American, he indulged himself in the European fashions, and he is ready to stoop as low as possible to complain about his own country. So he cannot be a patriot here. So this represents a few people who are supporting the British colony, British Empire, and they are not supporting the colonies who are fighting for independence. So this play, the contrast, also focuses on themes like marriage, patriotism, seduction that leads to the stress on women, obedience of children to repay to their parents or take care of their parents, and it also satirizes the European style. The next genre which we're going to move on is verse, where by the time of the American Revolution, many writers have ventured beyond the Puritan literary style. So probably yesterday's presentation, you would have focused more on the Puritan literary style, where they focus on the beliefs, they don't go against the rules, they are confined to certain ifs and buts, and especially being very religious. And you can find there is a kind of a transformation or a change in the verses which was produced during this American Revolution, which developed styles of writing that grew from distinctly American experiences. So the experiences during the revolts, the experiences during the Civil War, the experiences during the colonized time, or the impact of the British on the Americans, these experiences were brought through the verses during this American Revolution period. So this revolutionary era focused on songwriters. They wrote to inspire their listeners. So they were so very catchy songs, which the people, though if they are not able to read and write, they were able to take in that tune, they were able to take up that way it is being sung, which was an inspiration for them to voice against the British. So the songs about the events of the day were especially popular because everyone, even those who couldn't read or write, could join them in their campaign. So some patriotic songs were written by established writers of serious work. So some songwriters were verse writers were writing for the common people as well, in a very instrumental way, and they were able to get the attention of their listeners. And some writers, verse writers or poems were written in by writers who really worked seriously. And these poetic expressions of patriotism were very popular as well. And one among the prominent person is Philip Faneuil, 1752 to 1832. He is an American poet, a nationalist, a polemistic, a sea captain, and a newspaper editor. He also produced so many well-written and stirring patriotic poems that he became to known as the poet of the American Revolution. So he triggered the maximum number of my American minds to brought in the favor of patriotism in them. Another important or the best known revolutionary poet, being a woman, is Phyllis Wheatley, 1753 to 1784. She is an African American slave from Boston. But she was so popular that one of her patriotic verse added to the vocabulary of the revolution. In her 1775, the poem to General Washington, she coined the usage of Columbia to refer to the new United States. So Wheatley's poems were broadly welcomed for the revolutionary era. One more important verse is the Yankee Doodle. I think has little children in our kindergarten or in our primary school, we would have heard this rhyme. Yankee Doodle went to town riding on his pony. He stuck his feather in his cap and called it macaroni. So this is one of the rhyme which we all know, we sing not knowing the meaning. So this was a well-known American song during the Revolutionary period, and the early verses were dated before the 7 years of war that took place in America and the American Revolution. So it is sung patriotically, uh, patriotically in the United States, and the state anthem of Connecticut, which is even sung today. So here, the surrendering British soldiers looked only at the French soldiers, refusing to pay the American soldiers any heed. So you can see the picture of the soldiers here. Who let me tell you that this song was taken to be as a mock or a kind of a in a lighter vein, but later on it had its impact, mainly because of Marcus D. Lafayette, a military officer who was outraged and ordered his band to play this song, Yankee Doodle, in response to the British, how they responded. So this triggered, and you can see the Americans playing here with their own country flag, with their own instruments. They are opposing the Britishers. So this song, Yankee Doodle, pre-revolutionary war song, originally sung by the British military officers to mock the disorganized colonial Yankees who considered themselves to be what to say, a sophisticated people, with whom they served in the French and the Indian War. These Yankees seem to be stylish, or they assume themselves to be stylish, if they just have stuck one feather on their cap. Has this picture riding on his pony. This Yankee assumes himself to be one of upper class person just because he has stuck a feather on his cap. So this was actually a mocking. Later, it started to be a kind of a satire on the very British people itself. So Yankee Doodle was played by the British surrender at the Battle of Saratoga in 1770. It was comprising two significant battles, was a crucial victory for the Patriots during the American Revolution, and is considered to be one of the turning point of the Revolutionary War. So this writing by John Dickinson, as we saw earlier, 1732 to 1809. He is the author of the Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania to the Inhabitants of the British Colonies. Also wrote one of a popular song along with Yankee Doodle. One of the other song was the Liberty Song. So by 1781, Yankee Doodle had tuned from being an insult to being a song of national pride. So this was again a transformation. So the Liberty Song by John Dickinson, who is a pre-American Revolutionary War song with lyrics by John Dickinson. It was written as an outset to reflect the political strife caused by the Townshend Acts in 1769, the latest in the series of the British Crown taxes which levied on the colonies. The Liberty Song had its tunes, or it has been inspired by the Heart of Oak, the anthem of the Royal Navy in the United Kingdom. So the song itself was published in two colonial newspapers, the Pennsylvania Journal and the Pennsylvania Gazette, both on July 7th, 1768. I'm sorry. The Liberty Song is notable as one of the earliest patriotical songs in the 13 colonies. So John Dickinson's sixth verse offers the earliest known publication of the phrase that parallels to the motto, "We united we stand, divided we fall," a patriotical slogan that has prominently appeared several times throughout US history. So the lyrics of the song were updated in 1770 to reflect the growing tensions between the Great Britain, England, and the colonies, which is the 13 colonies in North America. So this new version, the title was changed to the Massachusetts Song of Liberty. So from the Liberty Song, it was changed to the Massachusetts Song of Liberty. So what was the results, the ultimate results of this revolutionary period or the revolution by the Americans? Among the significant results of this revolution were American independence and a friendly economic trade with Britain existed. So the war ended in 1783 and was followed by the period of prosperity. The national government was still operating under the Articles of Confederation and settled the issue of the Western territories, which the states ceded to Congress. So the American settlers slowly and rapidly they moved into these areas with Vermont, Kentucky, Tennessee, becoming states in 1790s. So the convention adopted a new constitution which provided for a much stronger federal government, including effective executive in a check and balance system with a judiciary and a legislation, which all this was imparted or contributed by different writers in literature during the American Revolution. So in 1776, these 13 colonies, once again bringing these 13 colonies to you all: Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, Pennsylvania, Delaware, New Jersey, Maryland, Virginia, North and South Carolina, and Georgia. They were declared their independence from the British after great efforts by many people. The American Revolution was also called the United States of America War of Independence, was the insurrection fought between 1775 to 1783, through which the 13 of Great Britain's North America colonies threw off the British rule to establish a sovereign United States of America, which was founded with the Declaration of Independence in 1776. The new government, under the President George Washington, an American political leader, military general, statesman, and the founding father, who served as the first president of the United States of America, took office in New York in March 1789. So these were the challenges in the literary field. America's literary independence slowed down because there was a lingering identification with England. Still, people were following the style of the British. Colonial writers of the revolutionary generation had been born English, so they associated and related to the British customs and ideas, though they were independent. So these challenges of building a new nation attracted talented and educated people in the fields of politics, law, and diplomacy, and writing did not pay. So the other challenge which faced by the literary genres were the difficult economic and political conditions which hampered publishing until 1825, where most American authors had to pay the printers to publish their works. Today it is a well-known fact that we pay our printers to publish, to type, to produce a book. It is something very common, but those days, until then, it was free, and in order to publish they had to pay the printers to publish their works, and that all began in America in 1825. So there was a lack of audience because the European authors were well known and they were preferred to the American writers, and these American writers were then budding writers, and their works were not welcomed by so many people. They had to struggle to gain audience and to gain popularity. So this was a small highlights of the American Revolution, focusing on the political and the political, the documents, the style, the founding fathers, the wars, and at last the independence. So I put up few reference also for you all, and I thank you all for your patient listening.
Thank you, ma'am, for
Thank you.
a very meticulous presentation. We are so happy, and I would just like to give you a data that when we started, we had around 75 members
Okay,
in the
thank
group. Now there are 95, and nobody left the meeting. So this credit goes to you because of the meticulous presentation that you have made.
Thank you, sir.
I would request our participants kindly put in your questions in the chat box. The chat box is open. And I'm sure the participants have enjoyed your presentation. Very shortly, we will be having the questions. So yeah, we thoroughly enjoyed the presentation. And you can see the congratulatory messages on the screen. I would request our participants, please. Yeah, definitely the session was a very fruitful one.
Thank you. Thank you all.
We feel so happy and honored when we have back-to-back very good sessions. And mind you, these are some of the comments which are given by associate professors
Thank you.
who are there in this group of ours. Ma'am, if you permit, I will put forward the first question.
Yes, sir.
Why did the American authors find it difficult to make a place in their own country?
As I told you all earlier, it is the early nationalism. It is just after the independence. They were struggling to find in their own identity. That is the purely American identity, not the traits of the British identity in them, be it in their writings, be it in their culture. So they found it very difficult to put into the place about their own country. So the authors, even today, if you take one of the African American country, if you take them, there are very less writers who sprung up and without that they are stopped. African American, even today, if you're going to look into, we don't have anyone so well after Toni Morrison and Soyinka and so many others. The same way the Americans to reach to that point, what they are today, they found it very difficult. It was not a smooth sailing at all. So the authors, though they were and the genres, one more thing which I should say is the genres, from pamphlet, from political writing, they had to move on to the other genres, which was again a representation of the British. So bringing in novel, which is not American, it is from the British, they had to bring in a kind of their own experiences, which took time for the Americans to welcome and to appreciate. So that period immediately after the independence was a little tough time for the American authors to find audience and to publish their writings.
Thank you, ma'am. The next question is, what do you think is the place of St. John's and his letters, particularly the letter, What is an American, in American literature and society?
So can I have the question once again, please?
Yeah, what do you think is the place of St. John's letters, particularly the letter titled as What is an American,
Yes.
in the American literature and society?
Yes, American literature and society, that as I told you, this particular period, this revolutionary period, started to bring in a lot of things which was entirely new for the Americans. Though they were divided, some for the British and some for the Americans, this particular writings focus mainly on what the need of Americans, what the Americans need. What they need basically was an identity for themselves. They wanted equality. They wanted a kind of a government which was not to oppress the people. So such kind of a aspects was there in his writing.
Thank you, ma'am. Can you throw some light on the role of women during this revolutionary period,
Yes,
if any? Yeah.
yes, there is, because the women writers, as I showed you, was one of the works by Phyllis Wheatley, who is an Afro-American. But we have few others also: Susan Wright, we have Martha Moore, we have Henna, then so many others, prolific writers. And the first female prolific writer was Agnes Stockton. So these writers, women writers, until otherwise, women were not welcomed in any of the part of the country. They were writing in the pseudonyms. So these women writers, they slowly started to write their own personal experiences. They started to write with the patriotic fervor, a mixture of genres in order to bring in, but their writings were not much welcome when the other documents or writings were not much welcome by the Americans itself. As I told you, authors of Americans were finding it difficult to publish their writings. But later on, gradually, these Americans, when they were able to find their own identity, their own style of writing, their own publication sources, so they looked upon the other writers, women writers, and they were able to know who was the first person, who was of what style did they write. Did they write in their pseudonyms, or did they write on patriotism, political, or their personal experience? So women writers were slowly coming into what is it, they were known. Slowly they were known.
Thank you, ma'am. The next question is, what did the American colonist mean by, under quotation, no taxation without representation?
Yes. No taxation without representation. The very statement itself by uh, by people, they wanted to, as I told you, the Stamp Act, the Boston Tea Party. On a basic commodity, tea, you can be taxed so much. And how can the Britishers do this? So this brought in, without any representation, over tomorrow morning I'm saying I'm going to tax you on this. You listen to one seminar, you'll be taxed so much. One online lecture, you'll be taxed so much. No one will step into that. So without any representation or prior information or notification, the taxes was imposed on every other things, every other commodities. So the Enlightenment period, has it said, people started to think by saying, we know taxation without representation. You tell us what you're going to tax us on. If we are okay, we will. If not, we will rebel. So that was the slogan.
Thank you, ma'am. Can you just comment briefly on the themes that were available during the early nationalism?
Yes, it was independence. It was a kind of seeking identity without the traits of the British. There were satires mocking the people who assume themselves to be a part of, being Americans, being a part of Britishers. There was writings on the political growth, the psychological, sociological, the cultural changes which underwent. So these were the themes which was focused in the early national period.
Thank you, ma'am. The next question is, what were the religious ideas of the Aboriginals Americans, the Red Indians, before the age that was influenced by Puritans?
Okay, the exploration period, the Native Americans. Okay, so they were these Native Americans. They were considered to be not like colonists or people belonging from this country, but rather they were termed as bands, BANDS. So each, like how we say, each community, each caste, they were called as each bands, and these bands had their own religious faith and belief. They had their own culture, their own way of dressing, their own way of worshipping God. So these bands, and they don't marry also in outside their bands. So such kind of Native Americans, they focus on probably I can tell you about the living Native American writer, Karen Louis Edrick, who speaks about these Native Americans, their psychological perspective, speak about women, who how they associate themselves, how they are not able to come out of their own Native American root, but yet to what is it, to fight with this modern thing. So such kind of things were looked into these Native American writings.
Thank you, ma'am. There are plethora, but we'll take few more. That's it.
Okay.
Because they were thoroughly enjoyed it. I'll put forward these questions to you, ma'am. So when you write the book chapter, you can include these questions with your answers. We plan to include it with the book chapter. If not, through some other medium, we will include it.
Okay.
Because some questions are very pertinent and very critical also. The next question is, has the Protestant work ethics adopted by the Americans significantly influenced American literature?
Once again, sir.
Has the Protestant work ethics
Okay.
adopted by the Americans significantly influenced the American literature?
Yes, of course, because the impact was so much on the Americans, the belief, Christianity, and the fear. Being Americans, as I told you, the bands, they had their own God, their own worshipping style. And when the Britishers came in, the Puritans, they were more pious and they adhered to certain rules, which the fear of God, being like a person who will immediately punish you for what you have done, you suffer for your sins, all these concepts was there. And when you listen 2 or 3 times, or when you move with people, naturally you inculcate those traits. So that had an impact in the American scenario as well.
I tell you, we have some very interesting questions. You will enjoy these questions.
Okay.
Before we move ahead, I will just take one question, and it is something which we have to think over it. I'll just take this. Please pardon all of the others. I'll try to take other questions as well. This is a question by Vijaya Samundeshwari.
Okay.
And she says that just 5 men were killed in the Boston massacre. Then why is it exaggerated as a massacre?
As I told you, this Boston massacre, I told you it was just killing of one boy, and you have told me here it is just 5 men. Okay, and it is because of um, the entire, the 5 men were killed, but the entire mob, the entire crowd was affected, injured, hurt, suffered, and these 5 men. Those families were hurt, those families were tormented. So this really triggered the other Americans, so which through words or through actions, which really caused a kind of a what is it, uneasiness in that. And as I showed you in the pictures, the firing by the Britishers. Okay, they, when they fire, usually you aim at the ground or at the sky or at the leg to just clear up the mobs. So at that time, many people were injured. So, and at the same time, killing of 5 men was something new at that time, which was considered to be a massacre. Today, we hear hundreds and hundreds. We're gone used to it. So those days, it was all something very new. That's why it is revolutionary period, something new.
Thank you, ma'am. So putting it so diligently and critically across. The next question is, during the Revolutionary War.
Okay.
This is also a very interesting question by Anshuman Mitro. He puts it as, during the Revolutionary War, what happens to the Red Indians? Do they take any side or do they remain neutral? And what position are they assigned?
No, they also had their part. These Red Indians or the Native Americans, as you said, as I told you, they remained in their bands. Even today, you can find these bands in America. These people are not much influenced by the technological or the changing scenarios as how we are today. No. If you take in parts of India, the almost all the states are technologically developed, and they are even developed in their literary way of writing, their attires, everything. But these Red Indians, as you say, and as I call them as Native Americans, they are still adhering to their dress, their tribal head, their bands, and their own way of worshipping or their own culture. They had their involvement, but they did not interfere much with the others.
Thank you, ma'am. The next question is by Dr. Usha Sharan, madam. She asks that does American nationalism find any evolution or change from its inception to the contemporary scenario?
Yes, yes, ma'am. Yes, it does. It does has a evolution. It has its change from what it was to now. Um, because uh, as I told you, even though they have gained independence, yet even today we find few people or down the years, the African Americans who were given their identity were not given their liberty. So there is a change, but today we welcome them. So that itself is a change. Within the country itself, they were looked down. They were not given their liberty. They were not given their freedom. They were looked down. But gradually, you see, down the years, down the centuries, there was, which was spoken of equality by these revolutionary writers, this period, like Patrick and Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson. That equality is being now given to the other Americans, like African Americans, the Chinese Americans, or the Indian Americans, in the American scenario presently. So I do think there is an evolution, there is a change.
Thank you, ma'am. We take the last question of the day. It has been thoroughly enjoying session, but we have to end this session. It has been a long session, so we take the last question of the day, which is also a very pertinent question. The question is by Dr. Sarla. She asks the question, and I put it forward: the manner in which George Eliot had to take over pseudo identity of a man, did women authors in America too face such discrimination?
Yes, yes, very much. Because not only in the American literature where women take up pseudonyms, but even in the British uh, literature, we find many people, women writers, taking up pseudonyms. It's only because the way how it is being put into the minds of the people all over the world that women are not given the privilege to do what the male do. So that concept was there in many people, though they are educated, though they have the mind to write, though they want to voice, but they something held them behind, and they wrote in the pseudonyms. It is found in almost all uh, the countries which has been colonized by the British Empire. You can find it in India and America. In the very British Empire itself, you can find such women writers slowly only emerging and not directly writing with their own names.
Well, that brings to the closure of this very captivating and enthralling session, I must say. And I really apologize to the participants. There are a plethora of questions, but I assure you, I would put it across to our resource person, who at her own ease of time can answer those. And we will get back to these questions and answers. We will try to put it across to the participants as well. Ma'am, on behalf of Team DAATH Voyage, I would like to thank you. It was an absolute honor and pleasure having you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Your presentation was very, very concrete, very informative, and at the same time, very lucid. So thank you so much. It was an absolute honor and pleasure to have you. See you soon. on this platform once again, provided you have time. And thank you, participants. We meet tomorrow again at 6. Ma'am, if you're free, please do join us for our further sessions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Sakit, and thank you, participants, for listening. I hope I've done justice to my presentation.
Definitely.
Thank you so much. And I look
Thank you.
forward and I wish this association to grow further very well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So kind of you, ma'am. Thank you so much. Participants, please take care. Ma'am, please take care. Good night. See you tomorrow at 6.
Thank you all.